All right, so today I'm going to be talking about the cell membrane. So we've been talking a little bit about the endomembrane system and how all eukaryotic organelles have this membrane around them, but surrounding the cell, you also have this membrane, and that's the one that's probably the most complex. We have a ton of stuff embedded in this membrane. So what's important about our cell membrane is that it separates the internal cell environment from the external environment. Okay, so it's really important that we have our cell membrane. Without a cell membrane, cells would not exist. They wouldn't be able to function the way that they needed to. So we're going to go over the very basics about these cell membranes and the things that you really need to know about them. So first off, I'm just going to go right up here to this box. So if we look, we have this row of phospholipids. So remember, when we're talking about a phospholipid, we have this little circle, and then we have our little tail. Okay, so for a phospholipid, that little circle is our phosphate group. And then you have two lipid tails. Okay, sometimes we just call them fatty acids. So two fatty acid tails. And so what's special about these is that the head of this is hydrophilic, the tails are hydrophobic. And so we call that anthopathic. Okay, so anthopathic means that you have two different polarities there. Okay, so the head itself is hydrophilic. The tails, because they're fatty acids, are hydrophobic. And so this gives the cell membrane really special properties. It allows certain things to come in and out, and then the tails like to stick together. And so because they stick together, it ends up forming a barrier. Okay, so that way our cell stays intact and the stuff that needs to stay outside is going to stay outside. And so because of these phospholipids, only certain things are going to be permeable. Only, certain things are going to be allowed in or out. And so, for example, okay, only small, nonpolar, okay, so remember, fats are nonpolar molecules. Okay, so things like hydrogen, nitrogen, or oxygen, okay, can pass right through. If you have a little bit of water will also go through. But we need special proteins that we're going to be talking about on the next page, for some of those larger molecules. And so that all has to do with this anthopathic characteristic that phospholipids have. So next, if I move on over, I see I have this cholesterol molecule. And so cholesterol helps the membranes be fluid. Okay, so what do we mean by that? That means that the molecules can freely move within the membrane. It's really hard to visualize this because we always see a membrane as a 2D structure, but we need to remember this is actually a 3D structure. It's almost like a hollow sphere, and then these phospholipids are covering that sphere. And so this cholesterol, this steroid, allows whatever is in these phospholipids to change places. Even these little proteins, these attachments that are, attached to the membrane, they can also change places. So we're going to be watching a video so that way you can kind of understand how that works. And not only that, cholesterol helps your membranes to be insulated. So what that means is whenever it gets too cold, your membrane's not going to freeze. And then when it gets too hot, it keeps everything together. And so it's not going to become too fluid. So all of that is because the cholesterol that's there. So next, I'm going to go ahead and move on up. Okay, so I have glycolipids, which is going to be this structure right here, and a glycoprotein, which is this structure right here. Okay, so how that's different, we're actually going to look at that on the next page. So you can see right here, I have a big protein right here, okay, and my little glucose molecules. Over here, this little glucose is probably attached to my lipid. So both of these are unique tags for the cell. Okay, so they help cells identify each other. ID each other. And so what's special about these, if you notice, okay, this is the outside of the cell. That's where this glycolipid is at. Same thing over here for this glycoprotein. It's facing the outside of the cell. And so essentially what these are receptors that can touch or interact with molecules or cells outside. So a very good example of this, okay, so would be our immune cells. Okay. So our immune cells need to recognize our own cells. So if they weren't able to recognize them, if they didn't have these little receptors on the outside of our cells, essentially what would happen is our immune cells would attack our own body cells and it would destroy them, because that's what immune cells do. They're going to attack foreign cells. And so we need to have those recognition markers in order for cells to recognize each other. Next, we're going to be talking about our membrane proteins. So I know my camera's really zoomed in so you can see me right, but if you look at this diagram, there's a ton of molecules, and it's even missing some of the ones from the front, like those glycoproteins and glycolipids and that cholesterol. There's a ton of stuff that's embedded in our cell membranes. And so all of this, the membrane proteins plus all of that stuff, lets us know that our cell membrane is also known as the fluid mosaic model. Okay, and that's just because of all the stuff that's found in the cell membrane. So proteins, lipids, steroids, things like that. And all of those things are necessary for the membrane to function the way it is. So how you're going to look at this picture. So up here at the top, I have transport proteins and receptor proteins. So all of our proteins that are embedded in our cell membrane can be divided up between these two. Okay, so whether it's something that allows molecules to transport, or whether it's a receptor that's going to communicate with molecules coming in or with other cells. Okay, so these are our two categories. Down here are different types. So these are 3 different types, and they're all going to signify where you're going to find them in the cell membrane. Okay, and that's as specific as we need to get. So for example, our transport proteins, obviously you could see it's stuff that's going in and out. Okay, so they allow specific molecules in and out. Okay, so this one, for example, okay, is an ion channel. I can see I have these chlorine ions that are traveling through. So I'm going to put example, chlorine ions. Okay, so this one right here, okay, like I said, channel protein. So my receptor proteins are going to be used for my signaling molecule. So I can see I have this little glucose molecule, and it's going to bind to this receptor protein. And you can see the receptor protein starts on the outside and ends on the inside. It's trying to signal something to the inside of this cell. And so they're important with helping cells talk to each other. So cell communication is one of my favorite things that we talk about in AP Bio that you don't talk about in freshman bio. And so we're really going to be focusing at that point how cells end up communicating so that way they can exchange information. And so with this, you're going to have some sort of signaling protein. And so the signaling protein will have a molecule that binds on the outside. Okay, so, and we call that a receptor. Okay. And so what ends up happening is this protein is going to change shape and it's going to signal a protein to do something on the inside. So changes shape to cause, let's see here, protein change slash signal inside the cell. So a good example of that we're going to talk about would be hormones. If you have a hormone that binds to a protein receptor, it's going to cause changes inside of the cell, and so you're going to have, you know, other molecules being produced once that hormone hits that signaling receptor. So, okay, our two proteins, transport and receptor. Okay. So of those, we're going to talk about where they're located inside of our membrane. Okay, and so essentially all of these are categorized by how stuck they are inside of this membrane. So if I'm looking at an integral membrane protein, so I can see right here, this one right here that's really big, it's really stuck in there. This one, stuck in about half of it. This one goes all the way through. So these are proteins that are permanently stuck in the membrane. Okay, so sometimes they're also known as transmembrane proteins, just because they do go all the way through. And so we have some that, you know, are hydrophilic, and that's why they stick to this phosphate group, and some part of it that's hydrophobic, and that's why they stick right here to the tails. We also have this guy right here. Okay, it's a lipid-anchored protein. Okay, so that's pretty self-explanatory. It's bonded to the lipids that are part of these little phospholipid tails. So, bonded to lipid found inside the membrane. All right, so they're lipid anchored. Our last one, okay, a peripheral protein. Okay, so these are proteins that are either on the surface or they're actually inside, so one of the two. Okay, usually they're attracted to the heads. Okay, so can be inside or outside. Usually attracted to the phosphate heads. Okay. And so these guys are not permanent. They can move. Okay, so these guys can move. They can move back and forth and in and out. All right, so these are the major proteins that are part of the cell membrane. Let me know if you have any questions.